It's a pleasure to be at this AGI Summer School in Iceland. If my calculations are right, there are four of us here who were at the previous AGI Summer School in Xiamen, China. So it's great to see the AGI meme and movement continuing to spread, and interesting to see it spreading in sort of out of the way corners of the globe, which is quite cool, especially for those of us who like to have an excuse to travel to interesting places. I'm going to talk today about the OpenCog architecture for AGI, and then in the main novel substance of the talk, about some ideas for bridging the traditionally perceived gap between symbolic and subsymbolic aspects of intelligence via integrating into the OpenCog integrative architecture hierarchical temporal memory architecture for perception, which is Itamar Arel's Destin architecture. The OpenCog architecture has been around a few years, and we're using it to control some virtual agents in virtual worlds. So it does some things. It's not amazingly generally intelligent yet, but it's functional and is improving month by month. The ideas I'll discuss about bridging the symbolic subsymbolic gap and connecting OpenCog to visual perception. This is stuff that is currently active research and doesn't do much yet, and therefore is more interesting for me to talk about, because I'm always more interested to talk about what I'm doing than what was already done last year. So this will be a mix of things we've done using OpenCog and things that we're now working on. I'll start with just a few words of what I consider to be AGI. I won't go into much depth on this, since this is the AGI Summer School, and people have probably filled you in on these generalities already. I think about general intelligence heuristically as the ability to achieve complex goals in complex environments. I don't mean by that explicitly goal-seeking behavior is necessarily the be-all and end-all of general intelligence. I mean, there are aspects of what humans do that are not explicitly oriented toward achieving goals. And ultimately, our conception of intelligence is going to change as we develop more and more intelligent systems. But this seems a useful way to think about intelligence for the time being. And as you've probably heard, Marcus Huder, Jürgen Schmidhuber, and some others have worked on grand general formalizations of what is general intelligence. And one thing you find from pursuing these formalizations is that human beings are not all that generally intelligent. I mean, if you compare a human being theoretically to an optimizer that can achieve any computable goal in any computable environment, which you can mathematically show in some sense exists, humans come out looking pretty stupid. No? I wouldn't take that too seriously personally, because I'm not sure that this conception of intelligence, of maximizing objective functions or goals in environments, is going to be the same way we think about intelligence 50 or 100 years from now anyway. But I do think there's something worthwhile in the observation that humans are not like maximally, totally, generally intelligent. We're actually a mixture of various specialized intelligent subsystems with some core that in some sense does have a very broad generality. I mean, our visual cortex is specialized to recognizing visual patterns. Our episodic memory is specialized for storing, retrieving, and organizing memories of our life history, and so on and so on. So our minds actually are quite specialized for a variety of different things, but yet we do have this capability to transfer knowledge from one context to another, and to explore areas like, say, abstract mathematics that are very different from anything that we were evolutionarily wired for. And this point comes up in the details of the architecture of the OpenCog system, which is why I'm dwelling on it here, because in my own view, the way you want to architect a general intelligence is to respect this mixture of components at various levels of specialization and generality that the human mind has. I mean, you might think as a computer scientist, well, let's make one totally general learning algorithm, which we can program in like 5 lines of Haskell or something, and this will be the core of thought, kind of like the equation of string theory is the core of physics or something. On the other hand, I don't think that's what you see in the brain. What you see in the brain is a mixture of components at various levels of generality and specificity all working together. And while I don't think we have to emulate the brain in detail, I think this particular characteristic of the brain is a natural, perhaps inevitable consequence of trying to achieve a modest amount of general intelligence given a modest amount of computational resources. Unlike the hypothetical, absolutely general intelligence, which takes infinitely much processing power. If you start to think about human-like general intelligence and what we do, it boils down into a really long, boring, ugly laundry list of different things. I mean, we have perception, actuation, memory, learning, reasoning, planning, attention, motivation, emotion. We can model ourselves and others. We interact socially. We communicate. We can build things. We can do quantitative inference. And each of these boils down to a whole bunch of different subcategories as well. Now, none of these are human-like general intelligence, yet the human approach to general intelligence draws on tools that evolve for handling each of these things. And if we want to build a human-like general intelligence, ultimately, we've got to deal with all of these things. I mean, we may start with one of them and then branch out to others, but those are all part of the requirements list. Now, when we build narrow AI systems, we're thinking about it a different way because we can focus on just a few capabilities. You can focus just on, say, self-driving cars or information retrieval or a game like chess, or as in some of the biology work I'm now doing, we're using machine learning and probabilistic reasoning to analyze the genetics of long-lived flies. We have these flies that live 5 times as long as regular flies. We want to see why they live so long. And, you know, that's a valid AI research. It's certainly interesting to use machine learning to see how different genes and proteins and networks combine together with each other. But that's lacking an ability to transfer knowledge from one domain to another. And the program has only one goal in this case, which is to find the combinations of genes and proteins that imply longevity. With general intelligence, we're not looking at any one particular goal like driving a car or finding why flies live a long time. You're looking for a system that can, in principle, do anything and learn anything. Although, of course, some things are going to take it longer to do or learn than others. So this has probably been pitched to you already, but if you're interested, the AGI 12 conference is in Oxford in early December, which is a collaboration with the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford. And they will immediately following AGI 12 have their own conference on the impacts of AGI and the philosophy of how to make AGIs be ethical as they get more and more intelligent, which is a separate but interesting topic that has some interface with the hardcore AI research. Also, if you haven't seen it, there's a paper that came out of the 2009 AGI Roadmap workshop that a number of us did at the University of Tennessee. And that paper is Mapping the Landscape of Human-Level Artificial General Intelligence. And that workshop was interesting, both intellectually and, I would say, anthropologically. So it was an outgrowth of a previous workshop. The previous workshop was convened by John Laird and Pat Langley, who are sort of part of the, you could call the cognitive architectures or traditional AI establishment in the US. And Langley and Laird organized a workshop at the University of Illinois, and the goal of that was to bring together everyone working on human-level AI, which is a term they prefer to the term AGI, and try to come to some common understanding of how to approach human-level AI. What are the metrics for evaluating progress toward human-level AI? What are the principles that should underlie architectures for human-level AI? Now, that workshop led to some interesting discussions, but it's fair to say it did not achieve that goal. The level of disagreement among the people in the room was so radical that pretty much we couldn't agree on much of anything, except that a human-level AI ultimately should be able to do everything a human could do, which we didn't need a conference to tell us. So Itamar, Arel, and I decided to try again and organize a similar workshop with people who were a bit more like-minded. So I tried to gather together people who were not thoroughly committed to, say, a symbolic approach to AI. So I invited only people whose AGI approaches didn't involve any like hard-coded production rules. So only people who were interested in AGIs that could learn from experience. And also only people who were at least interested in robotic or virtual embodiments. So try to get only researchers who wanted to build AGIs that could learn from experience by interacting with and experiencing some 3D world with some vague resemblance to the world that we humans live in. Now, unsurprisingly, but amusingly, this group also couldn't agree on much of anything, so, although it was quite narrowed down from the scope of those original workshops. However, we did agree on enough to write a paper describing our various perspectives and their interrelations and regarding not the architecture of how to build an AGI, but more what kind of tasks and scenarios made sense for testing an AGI and for gradually growing an AGI and mediating its development from nothing to human-level intelligence. And it was somewhat interesting. That paper was in AI magazine not long ago, which is progress. It's not the first time this sort of stuff has appeared in AI magazine, although their bias is toward narrow AI. In 2006 or 7, Nick Casamatis did a special issue on human-level AI in there also. So it does pop up now and again with modestly but significantly increasing frequency. We could not, in that workshop, agree on what kinds of environments were best for AGI. A lot of interesting ideas were thrown out there. I mean, Sam Adams from IBM had the idea of a general video game playing environment where basically you'd want your AGI to be able to play any video game at all. I mean, just throw it the game, give it the controller, and let it play. Now, in one version, you'd make it use robotics to move the physical controller. In another version, you could just connect it digitally to the game console, which I think is reasonably fair. Alexei Samsonovich was championing basically school, give it schoolwork, grammar schoolwork or high school work, pretty much paper schoolwork, but of a variety of different types. Josha, who was there, was advocating an approach to video understanding and movie understanding with tests like, among others, look at this 10-minute scene of a Hollywood film, tell me what happened. What do you think is going to happen next? Why did that character do that? Which involves integration of a whole bunch of different kinds of understanding. I was advocating some sort of AGI preschool, where you take your AGI either in a robot in a preschool setting or in a video game character in a kind of video game setting where it can play with various things. Let it go through the various kinds of training and playing exercises that young children do. Now, you can see all these different scenarios are sort of getting at the same thing, but you can also see some significant differences there in terms of what you'd actually need to build. I mean, in Josha's suggestion at that time of video and scene and story understanding, I mean, you don't need to mess with the mechanics of actuation, right? You don't need a hand to build stuff, be it a virtual hand or a robotic hand. On the other hand, Josh Hall, who was also at that workshop, he advocated the Wozniak coffee test. So Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple, had said once, no robot will ever be able to walk into a random house in America and make a cup of coffee. By which he meant, find where the coffee grounds are stored, look around, find the appropriate machine, figure out how to use it by looking at all the dials, and figure out where's the cupboard to get the cup and so forth. Common sense understanding. And he was, I assume, ruling out the approach where the U.S. sends Census Bureau people to every house in the U.S. and draw a map of everyone's living room and everyone's coffee machine. It was supposed to be general learning in the domain of making coffee, but still deal with any house and any coffee machine. And Josh really believes you got to do that. You got to deal with real-world sense perception, real-world actuation, or else ultimately you're doing something that's going to be narrow and can be codified in some long list of expert rules or something equivalent. So basically he believed you needed a robot, and this is one of the disagreements that we couldn't overcome in the context of this workshop. And I dwell on this because it gets at the meat of this talk, which will come a little later, in terms of what we're doing now, aiming toward integrating OpenCog with robots as opposed to the virtual characters that we've mostly been working with. And I have been, as I work more and more with virtual worlds, I've been drifting further and further toward, wow, a robot would be a good idea. No? I'm not extreme like Josh Hall or Rodney Brooks or these guys who think you need robotic embodiment to make AGI. I mean, I think you could make an AGI using only a text stream of input. I mean, it's more a matter of what's going to be easier, what's going to be a faster way to do it, what's going to be a way that we can understand better and debug it better and guide it better, what will take the most modest amount of computing resources and human attentional and cognitive resources to build, rather than there being some magic in a robot body as typically perceived. So that's some general framing. Now I'm going to talk a bit about OpenCog, and I'll go through this at a fairly high level because I want to get to the symbolic, subsymbolic integration stuff before the time has expired. So I'll start off here with some speculative futurology. So I'm often asked this not so much by AGI researchers, but by journalists and people from the general public, or by rich guys who don't actually want to give me any money, but just want to gloat about the fact that they could if they wanted to. And like, if I were to give you $20 million or $100 million, although I won't, ha ha ha, then how fast could you build an AGI at that point? And of course the answer is we have no idea. Anyone who's done radical science knows sometimes things actually go way faster than you thought. Oftentimes things go way slower than you thought, and you don't know what are the hidden problems till you're going through the work. But nevertheless, we have to make a plan to guide work, even though we know that it won't actually be followed. So when we try to plot out what could be done with OpenCog, if we could hire as many people as we wanted and buy all the computers that we wanted, we come out with something like this. What we're doing now is what I call a proto-AGI virtual agent. I mean, we're using OpenCog system to control a virtual agent in a virtual world. It's not all that generally intelligent. It does do things, and it learns things, and it builds stuff in the world. Assuming our funding holds out, and we don't run into any unforeseen technical obstacles, in the next few years, we'll be able to get the AI system smarter and smarter in the virtual world in terms of doing simple childlike stuff in the virtual world, and we'll get started in a serious way on the robot integration. A couple more years for more advanced learning and reasoning. Then the way I see things proceeding in practice is I think we're going to be able to build, I don't want to call them expert systems because that has historical baggage, but I think we're going to be able to build AGI systems that, it sounds kind of funny, but that are generally intelligent in a way that's focused on particular domains. And it's like a narrow AGI, but I mean, to think about that in a specific context, think about a home service robot. I mean, or Wozniak's coffee test, a robot that could do that. I mean, you could imagine an AGI that could be a reasonable home service robot and could go into an average house and make coffee, yet wouldn't actually be able to teach third grade, ride a motorcycle, prove a theorem, compose a sonnet, or even write a decent letter. I mean, I would argue once you've got something that can pass the coffee test or be a home service robot, you've got in there the crux of an AGI algorithm and architecture that could be used to do anything humans can do. On the other hand, in actual practice, there may be a gap of years between getting the first AGIs that display some common sense learning and general intelligence in a specific domain and actually manifesting the possibility of that architecture to do everything that humans can do. I mean, will be a short period of time on the historical scale, but maybe years anyway. I mean, could conceivably be a decade or two. That's really hard to say. The service robot is one example. Another example tying into my bioinformatics work will be a bioscientist. I mean, say, right now we use narrow AI to do machine learning and crunch various biology data sets. But you can imagine a narrow AI / AGI bioscientist that could read research papers in a reasonably general way, extract the meaningful information from biology research papers, integrate that with machine learning, run biology lab equipment, without being able to do every single thing that the human being could do. So I think we're going to see that because that's what the world wants. The world will pay for proto-AGI systems that do specific things. And out of that, eventually we're going to see full-on human-level AGI. And out of that, we're going to see something going beyond the human level. I mean, ultimately, as Kristen has talked and written about, I mean, the human brain has many weaknesses. One of them is it gets old and dies. And another one is that when we open it up and try to tinker with it, we tend to cause it to function even worse than it usually does. Whereas an AGI system won't necessarily have any built-in impediments to self-modifying and improving its own code. So you can envision once you have an AGI that has the general intelligence of a computer scientist, you can have a lot of really fascinating pathologies as it reprograms itself in stupid ways and becomes demented. But you could also have some very rapidly improving levels of general intelligence. And I think, in theory, we could see all this unfold within the next decade. But that would require things to go well. It would require society to decide to fund AGI reasonably amply so that AGI teams weren't working half-time on AGI and half-time on narrow AI, or not advancing at all, as is the case with some AGI designs. So right now, we're developing the OpenCog architecture toward AGI, and we're also developing it with various applications in mind. So we're using it to control video game agents. We're using OpenCog to crunch biology data. We're using it for financial prediction on the Hong Kong stock market. And this, at the upper corner, is a screenshot of our current video game world, which is Minecraft-like. It's built in the Unity 3D game engine, but it lets the AGI build stuff out of little blocks, basically tens to hundreds of thousands of little blocks. So it's a bit more ambitious than the good old blocks world from decades ago, but it follows some of the similar intuitions that building with blocks it's a domain in which you can give the AGI a combination of perception, action, reasoning, learning, social interaction, and so forth, but it's fairly computationally tractable. Before that, we're using it to control a virtual dog in a virtual world that learned tricks, basically. And the robot at the bottom is from some experiments we did in 2008 and 2009 using OpenCog to control a now humanoid robot at Xiamen University in China. That project is sort of mothballed at the moment, but we're looking at a different robotics project involving the Hanson Robocon that I'll discuss in a moment. So on the very high level, as I said, you can look at general intelligence as the ability to achieve complex goals in complex environments. And what that basically means is an intelligence needs to use its perception and its memory to predict what actions will achieve its goals. And of course, that's really easy, right? Memory, we already have memory in the computer. Perception, hook up a camera. Action, hook up some arms. And just hook up a universal, all-powerful prediction algorithm, and it's all done. But the problem is the universal, all-powerful prediction algorithm takes infinitely much computer power to run. So we have to get subtler than that and put a bunch of fairly well-architected things in each of these slots to get it to do anything. And to approach AGI in practice, there's a lot of big questions we need to ask, and different researchers answer them differently. So, do we want a single cognitive process, which is at the core, and there's a kind of periphery around it? I mean, Pei Wang's approach is a bit like that, as I understand it. He has a non-axiomatic logic, and he has a logic engine built on this unique and interesting logic. He doesn't necessarily think that logic is it, but that logic is the center. And then you have something dealing with visual perception, language processing, procedure learning, and so forth. And these are sort of implemented in terms of the one core logic. And at the other end of it, something like Jeff Hawkins or HMR Arouse architectures, which are based on hierarchical temporal memories. Again, for them, the hierarchical pattern recognition network is the core. And anything else that you have is sort of at the periphery, helping that hierarchical pattern recognition network to do its thing. Another approach is there is no core complex process. You just got a bunch of small, simple elements together interacting according to some complex dynamics, and intelligence emerges out of that. And many people in the artificial life community think of intelligence that way, and I think that's quite interesting. It seems to me harder and to involve more computing resources than engineering something. Another approach is to take a number of complex processes, a number greater than one, and hook them together in a complex way. OpenCog is more like that. It's what I would call an integrative architecture. So we have a probabilistic logic engine. We have a probabilistic evolutionary learning engine called Moses for procedure learning. We use something attractor neural network-like for attention allocation. Each of these is its own complex story. And actually, I could tell a story for each of them why it could be the core of an AGI system if I wanted to. But I think the best approach is to integrate a bunch of them together. Again, another difference in focus between different AGI researchers is some folks focus on the architecture. SOAR is a good example. You talk to John Laird. I mean, his view is, yeah, we haven't done much with learning yet for the last, 30 years or so, but that's because we need to get the architecture perfectly right. And once you have the architecture right, making learning work within the architecture is no problem. On the other hand, you look at people in the reinforcement community, they're like, well, no, we don't have a cognitive architecture, but we're getting learning based on reinforcement. And once you get learning based on reinforcement, then the architecture is kind of just something you glue on and wrap around your learning engine, right? And each of these approaches has taught us a lot. I tend to think you need a good architecture and good learning algorithms, and they need to work together well, which makes things even more complicated. Then you have the issue of knowledge representation. I mean, some folks, going back to SOAR or ACT-R, for example, you have explicitly represented knowledge, and which is often called symbolic knowledge. You have knowledge where you can look at a knowledge item in the system's knowledge base, and as a human being, you can kind of read out in natural language what that piece of knowledge represents. Like a cat is an animal, or to pick up a cup of coffee, I must extend my arm and open my fingers. The other approach is to look at implicit knowledge representation, where the structures that emerge from the interaction of the system's atomic elements spawn context-appropriate knowledge representations. And so to see what is the system's representation of a cup of coffee or of cats and animals, you would need to be able to decode the complex interactions and networks of the system's elementary components, just like it's hard to look in the brain and see how a piece of knowledge is implemented. And again, you can see the pattern of my way of thinking. In OpenCog, we use both, the explicit and the implicit forms of knowledge. So what you can see is that I hate to make these choices. So I just think the mind uses all of these approaches in different aspects and makes them work together. And an AGI system to work with feasible computing resources is probably going to have to do that too. So if you look at opencog.org, there's more information. I'm going to give a few more slides in OpenCog too. The book, The Hidden Pattern, that I wrote a few years ago, goes over a bunch of philosophy of mind, but also talks some about the AGI architecture. It talks about the Novamente cognition engine, which was a proprietary system that was a predecessor to OpenCog, but it is conceptually similar. Building Better Minds is a book I've been working on, it seems like forever, which actually exists in a complete draft form now and should go to the publisher in a few months, probably come out early next year, which goes over the OpenCog design in great detail. Another way to think about everything that a system like OpenCog has to do. This diagram comes from Aaron Sloman with a few tweaks by myself. What we see here, we have an environment, we have perception and action, we have long-term memory, and associate with it long-term thinking processes, which he calls deliberative processes. You have working memory, which is related to what's been called short-term memory. Associated with that, you have what Sloman calls reactive processes. You have some specialization for things like language and metacognition. Then you have arrows pretty much going between everything and every other thing, because there's so much feedback in the mind. And one thing you could do is follow cognitive science and just try to put one thing in each of those boxes and then connect them together. That's a little bit like what Stan Franklin has done with his LIDA architecture. I mean, he's taken the kind of box and line diagram drawn from cognitive neuroscience and put a certain AI algorithm and structure in each box. In OpenCog, we've done something a little different, but we still try to achieve all of those functions. So for knowledge representation, as I said, we use both explicit and implicit knowledge representation. We do them within the same data structure, which is a weighted labeled hypergraph that we call the atom space. Some nodes and links in the atom space represent explicit logical relations, like a cat is an animal, or more complex things involving nested quantifiers. Some nodes and links in the atom space are more like Hebbian links in an attractor neural network, which are learned by experience and which represent knowledge via their collective coordinated activity patterns. So an example of explicit knowledge here, this is a bunch of nodes and links that are labeled. Like there's a cat node, a dog node, a jazz node, a tail node, representing cats have tails and so forth. And these may be there in OpenCog's network if the network has read stuff or heard language, because then it will brew nodes internally to correspond to the words it's heard. On the other hand, you can also have a lot of nodes and links that have no labels on them and don't correspond to any particular thing that a human could describe. Say in this one, the top cluster of nodes and links pertains to chickens. The bottom cluster of nodes and links pertains to food. Some of the nodes have words attached. Some of them just represent placeholders inside the system's knowledge base, where the weights of their links to other things are what is significant. And you got a whole bunch of links of different types, going from the chicken bundle of nodes and links to the food bundle of nodes and links. And you could look at it as just an overall collection of synapses relating the one to the other, or you could look at each node and link and its specific semantics. We look at there as being a number of major types of memory in OpenCog, and one of the architectural decisions we made is to treat each of these kinds of memory somewhat separately. So we look at declarative memory, which is facts and beliefs, and we handle that using a probabilistic logic engine called PLN, Probabilistic Logic Networks. And there's a book on that was published by Springer in 2008. Procedural knowledge of how to do things, we represent by little programs in a Lisp-like language called Combo. And these little programs are learned by a system called Moses, which does probabilistic evolutionary learning, which means it's kind of like genetic programming, but instead of crossover and mutation, you do probabilistic modeling of the evolving population, and then generation of new programs by instance generation of the distribution found to model the population. For episodic knowledge, we use a simulation engine, among other things, which is sort of a detailed engine simulating the 3D world, and we also use a kind of sparse distributed memory. For attentional knowledge of what to pay attention to at each point in time, we use something kind of like a Hebbian neural network. We call it economic attention network, so it spreads virtual money among the nodes and links rather than spreading activation, but it's supposed to simulate the way activation spreads through the brain, kind of making a moving bubble of attention go through. So each of these kinds of memory has a different knowledge structure, a different software data structure associated with it, and a different learning mechanism associated with it in OpenCog. And then these all have to work together. And so from a big picture, what distinguishes OpenCog from most AGI approaches out there is that rather than having one AI representation and one learning or reasoning engine at the core, we have a number of big, complicated representations and learning and reasoning approaches and they're all configured in a way that lets them work together and communicate with each other and help each other out when they run into bottlenecks, such as those caused by combinatorial explosions. And this makes OpenCog bigger and more complex and annoying to work with than a system that's based on a single algorithm. I think it also gives it a higher odds of success. So I already talked about Moses and PLN, which are probably the two biggest cognitive algorithms and structures in OpenCog. If you want to learn more about those, there's a book on PLN called Probabilistic Logic Networks. Moses is described in Moshe Luke's 2006 PhD thesis, metacog.org, and this is all also open source code available on opencog.org. The core of it is C++. Some bits like PLN are in Python. So this picture, I know no one can read it, but you can see the beautiful topology of it anyway. So that's is my attempt to summarize the OpenCog architecture in one picture, which is very difficult. But what we have in the center is the atom space, which is a repository of nodes and links. What we have in those boxes at the top are the various cognitive processes like PLN, Moses, attention allocation, and so forth, which act on that repository of nodes and links, creating new nodes and links, destroying old ones, modifying parameters of existing ones, such as the truth values of logical nodes and links, the attention values indicating how much attention to associate with nodes and links. Then at the bottom here, we have stuff for getting information into and out of the atom space and interfacing it with the real world. So perception, action, and language. And that's going to be the focus of the end part of this talk, is basically this little hierarchy here, perception hierarchy. Like, how do you get data from the messy, complex, rich physical world, say visual or auditory data, into this atom space of nodes and links? So what one can do, and what I do, for example, in Building Better Minds, one can take this sort of general cognitive architecture diagram, which is from Aaron Sloman in this case, with a couple of tweaks, and one can take an OpenCog diagram with all the different representational learning components in OpenCog. One can go through and systematically say, okay, which aspects of OpenCog tie into which aspect of the overall human cognitive architecture diagram, and that's done in the chapter of the Building Better Minds book. Now, one exercise I thought of doing, but haven't had time to do, which would be really interesting, which could be another workshop sometime, is take a cognitive architecture diagram of the human mind, something like this, try to drill down in a little more detail. And I wrote a paper trying to do that in the book that Pei and I edited on the foundations of AGI. I just tried to take this diagram and then blow out each box and do another diagram, basically, to try to get some kind of overall cognitive architecture diagram for how human intelligence works, coming from cognitive psychology more than from AGI. But then what you want to do is take each AGI architecture and map its structures and dynamics into the ones from the human mind. And I've done that for OpenCog. It was a fair bit of work. I mean, if I had a few weeks, I could do that for a lot of other AGI architectures also. But I think that would be an interesting way to see what are the relations between different AGI architectures, which often achieve qualitatively the same things by many different mechanisms. So right now, the main nexus of work on OpenCog is in Hong Kong, which is where I'm now based. And we're using OpenCog to control these little video game characters. And this is an old version of the Minecraft world. It's now richer than that. So we have even cooler looking virtual robot than that now, but that's the one that we were working with when I made this slide. But basically, animated characters go around in a virtual world made of blocks and try to learn how to do stuff to achieve their goals. So this is a video from like 6 months ago or something. I didn't manage to make a new video, but this shows the robot in the previous version of our Minecraft-like world carrying out a behavior similar to most human beings. It has two goals, stability and energy. So for energy, it wants to get a battery to get more electricity. For stability, it wants to stay in its house. So basically, it sits in its house till it starts to run out of power. Then when it does, it runs out and grabs a battery. Then once it's got enough power, it goes back and hides in its house again where it's safe. This is sort of the archetype of caveman behavior, right? You come out of its cave to get food and then go back, which is kind of simple and boring, but illustrates the agent interacting with its world to achieve a goal. What?
Is there a limit on what battery has time, kind of? Or?
No. Well, you mean is there? Well, once it has its. Well, it can get as many batteries as it wants, but its energy will only go to a certain level. So, I mean, just like you could eat a lot, but at a certain point you're not getting any more useful energy from it, right? So, what we're working on now that I didn't manage to pull together a video about is more stuff with blocks building. So, for example, let's say the agent's battery is up here and it's down here. It wants to get the battery. The guy comes along here, oh no, I can't get up there, the battery's up too high. So then it figures out to grab together a bunch of blocks or other objects that are available and make steps, climb up the steps to get the battery up here. So basically building with blocks in order to help it achieve simple goals in the game world. And that example I just described works now and a couple other simple examples. I mean, it's not incredibly robust in the sense that sometimes it's too stupid to learn to do that and sometimes it isn't. Yeah.
How much learning is involved in that process?
That's a complex question, actually. I mean, we built in blocks as a primitive, right? So it can see within a certain field of vision, it can see the position of each block in terms of the coordinates. And in terms of the fact that a battery gives it energy, it has to learn that a battery gives it energy rather than a block. And it has a built-in vocabulary of spatial relations. So the above relation, for example. If this pen is on this box, it will receive as data, pen is above box, pen is next to box, and so forth. Now, more fuzzy relations, it has to learn. So if something is on top of something that's on top of something else, it has to learn that. But it has a basic vocabulary of spatial relationships, which is kind of like the 3D region connection calculus. And given the basic vocabulary of spatial relationships and time, before, after, during, and so forth, Allen's interval algebra, given those things, and given the built-in goals of get energy, get stability, get novelty, and so forth, it has to learn everything else. Well, actually, though, there's one other exception, which is a navigation algorithm is built in. So it does navigation by A star. If it wants to get from point A to point B, it has a built-in primitive to tell it how to get from point A to point B. But in terms of building stuff, that's all learned. I mean, it has to learn that piling blocks is something useful to do, right? It has to learn when it gets next to a block and steps forward, it winds up on top of the block instead of to the left of the block, and so forth.
So the learn skill, do you remember and use?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely remembered. That's easy. That's the easy part. It can even be forgotten. Getting it to be used, I mean, the generic answer is yes, but getting learned knowledge to be transferred intelligently is a kind of open-ended and difficult problem, right? So, I mean, learning to build stairs, it's gaining some knowledge that would help it build stairs in some other context. But to be honest, we haven't, since we're still in the process of getting it to reliably do the simple things, rather than do them only occasionally, we haven't yet really explored how effectively the knowledge transfers from one context to another. That's sort of Jared Wigmore's PhD thesis, which he's in the process of writing. So, There's a lot of work still to be done in the virtual world, actually, but I've also been working toward the next step, which is going from the virtual world into a robotic embodiment, which is what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes. I mean, the virtual world is great. It encompasses perception, action, social interaction, learning, language, a sense of self and other. I mean, building and construction, quantitative reasoning. Pretty much anything you could think of is there in some simplified form in the virtual world, which makes it, if nothing else, a great approach to prototype different aspects of your code. On the other hand, you have to wonder whether the lack of rich perceptual data and a rich set of motoric affordances, you have to wonder how much of that is hurting your system ultimately. And more, when I look at what the system does in the virtual world, granted we have a lot more work to do there, I'm more and more convinced that a robotic embodiment is going to be useful. And my general intuition there is based on the fairly obvious observation that the learning algorithms tend to find the cheapest, simplest, most ridiculous way to solve a problem that they possibly can. I mean, whatever shortcut they could find to solve the problem posed by the environment, they will tend to find it. Now, of course, you try to counteract that capability by Occam's razor, by having it try to find a solution that not only solves the problem that it faces, but does it in the simplest way. The idea being that if it does it in the simplest way, that capability will then generalize more broadly to other contexts. But that's just very hard to tune. I mean, tuning the Occam constraint to find the simplest way of doing something versus the ability to actually do the problem that's subtle. I mean, there are many different ways to implement Occam's razor. And there's a strong tendency of the system, of our learning system, and all other ones I've worked with in machine learning context as well, to overfit to the data that it has, which in a virtual world context would mean finding ways to solve problems that work in that virtual world that you made. And you can try to solve that by making more and more complex virtual worlds, put hundreds of thousands of blocks in there, eventually do away with blocks and have continuous substances and so forth. But ultimately, you wondered, like, to a large extent, the human mind is overfit to the specific environments that we evolved for. I mean, we have some generality of intelligence, which is wonderful, but in many aspects, we are specifically adapted to what we grew up for. And you're fighting against that when working in a virtual world. Not to say that you can't win the fight by using Occam's razor heuristics well enough and making a complex enough virtual world, but it's unclear whether winning that fight is easier than just giving your AGI access to the same world that we have access to. And robots still suck relative to what we'd like for AGI, but they are getting better and better. I couldn't resist showing a picture of myself with Philip K. Dick's robotic head, which will be awesome to put on the first AGI, although. A more useful technology I recently found out about are these fingertips by a country called SynTouch, which you may have seen in the newspaper. In some machine learning experiments, they were trained to distinguish a bunch of different things more accurately than the human fingertip, using a combination of pressure, temperature, and motion sensors. Now, currently they're like $6,000 or $7,000 for a single fingertip. But I've actually I've discussed with those guys scaling up by using some Chinese manufacturers. They reckon you can get it down to like $100 for a fingertip, and just by manufacturing at scale. But of course, what you could do for fingertips now, in 5 or 10 years, you could do for the rest of the body. Then you'd have a robot with skin. I mean, Hansen's RoboKind, which we're exploring using for OpenCog now, has quite realistic facial expressions and flexible skin. I mean, we've seen quad-rotor drones are always in the news now, or in heavy development. So it may, and the PR2 from Willow Garage, which you see in the upper corner, that's like $400,000 or something. So it's beyond OpenCog's funding at the moment, but it's almost capable physically of doing something like Wozniak's coffee test. It can't go upstairs. It has wheels. But its grabber hands actually work to pick stuff up. It can open cabinets. Its camera eyes work well in real-world lighting conditions. So it may be that now, as opposed to 10 years ago, we're verging on the point where working with robots is not a stupid thing for AGI researchers to do. I mean, it's marginal. We're right around that borderline, because every time I've worked with robots, I've regretted it because they're such a pain in the ass and they always break and something doesn't work. And then you wind up not learning what you wanted to learn about AI and just learning that working with robots is annoying. But it's getting better and better. So I think it's at the point now where robots are getting to be interesting from an AGI point of view. And by experimenting with virtual worlds, we're starting to see more and more the limitations of that approach in terms of the amazing propensity of learning algorithms to overfit to the specific environment that you give them. So I'm running out of time. I won't dwell too much on this. But we did hook up OpenCog to a robot using a bunch of hacks and glue and so forth in 2009 in Xiamen University. We hooked it up to a vision system, and to Ray Ting, who's in the back of the room, hooked it up to a natural language system. So it could take basic text or voice commands using third-party speech-to-text technology. You could tell it, like, go to that chair, it recognized the chair, and go to the chair. And you could train it by supervised learning to recognize a chair. So it's very simple, which is basically just to show that we could do it, right? Now, what I'm talking to David Hansen about now is connecting OpenCog to the RoboKind humanoid robot, which not only has a better face and more realistic emotional expressions than Now, it has much better camera eyes, which was an unforeseen problem with the Now. The eyes in the Now are just not that good, and they don't give real stereo vision. There's one eye here and one eye that looks down, which is really weird, whereas the Hansen robot has two eyes in front, so you can do regular stereo vision. So I think working with the Now did kind of work, and it was cool in that, I mean, you can actually use their pre-built software for walking and grabbing and so forth. You don't need to do all the low-level robotic stuff yourself. The camera eyes were the worst limitation, which is weird, because cameras are not that bad these days, but it's because they kind of overfit the hardware for robot soccer. The eye looking down is really good at seeing where the soccer ball is going, which isn't what you want in most contexts. But the RoboKind has much better specs than the Now in many regards, and in a couple years more we'll have things with even better specs. So what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes, and then we can go into this more in the discussion session if there's interest, is what we're doing now to bridge the gap between symbolic and subsymbolic AI. And actually, both of those terms are kind of contentious and often misused. In concrete terms, what I'm talking about is taking OpenCog and connecting it to Itamar Erel's hierarchical temporal memory system for visual perception. And OpenCog is not a purely symbolic system. We do attention allocation by something like Hebbian learning, which is arguably as sub-symbolic as it gets. And on the other hand, Itamar's system, it is sub-symbolic. On the other hand, he builds in a lot of guidance to help with symbol formation. So when you really dig into the definitions of symbolic and sub-symbolic, everyone defines those terms differently, and they may be of more historical interest than anything else. But it does at least point you at a certain area of research. OpenCog is heavily symbolic. There's a strongly symbolic aspect. Destin is mainly focused on sub-symbolic, low-level perception from high-dimensional visual and auditory data. And we're looking at putting them together to make a system that can do intelligent things in the context of humanoid robotics. If you're familiar with Jeff Hawkins' system, HTM, built in Numenta, Itamar's system, Destin, is somewhat like that, but it seems to work much better. At least it works much better than the Numenta version that's available for download from their website. I don't know what exactly their new version does. And it has a similar architecture, which is modeled conceptually on the hierarchical layout of the cortex. I mean, the cortex, if you unwrapped it which I don't recommend to try at home, but if you unwrap the cortex and flatten out the layers, you get 6 cortical layers, pyramidal neurons at the center of columns, spanning those layers perpendicularly, a lot of interneurons between them. Each cortical column with a pyramidal neuron down the middle has various mini columns inside it with architectures that are different in different parts of the brain. And you know, neither Jeff Hawkins nor Idemar are trying to emulate that architecture in detail, but they're trying to emulate it conceptually by having hierarchical layers and processing that goes up and feed forward and down and feedback and then propagates across each layer. To me, that's a bit overdone. I mean, I think that vision and audition have that architecture very heavily. If you look at olfaction, for example, that's a combinatory architecture with connections tangling all over. And much of the cognitive cortex evolved from the reptile's olfactory bulb, not from vision or audition. So I'm not sure emphasizing the hierarchical structure as much as these guys do is really right. The brain is so complex with all these differently architectured modules. On the other hand, for vision or audition, I think it's a reasonable approximation, particularly for the lower levels of processing, which is why I'm interested in Idemar's system destined mainly as a visual and auditory cortex for OpenCog, whereas he is interested in it as a foundation for full-blown AGI. Although we have these different views, we're still able to collaborate on this. And similarly, we've borrowed in OpenCog many ideas from Josha's micropsi architecture. We haven't taken his knowledge representation, which is also quite interesting and powerful, but the way that Josha chose to break down goals, motivations, actions, urges, demands, and do action selection and so forth, we've borrowed that in OpenCog and using it in a somewhat different way. So inside Destin, you have multiple layers, sort of like that cortex model that I showed you. They're divided into squares. I would have chosen hexagons, personally, but Idemar designed it, and we're stuck with the squares for the moment. That the lower levels of the hierarchy pertain to smaller perceptual regions, smaller regions of space-time in general. As you go up the hierarchy, each square refers to a larger region of space-time, and the input at each time, it's a pixel array, which is splayed across the two-dimensional array. So 3D vision has to be done at the higher levels by some sort of cognitive processing. It gets 2D input. And each node is a certain spatial temporal region. Higher level nodes refer to higher regions. The children of a node refer to its subregions. Then there's processing going up and down. The node representing a region of space-time based on which cluster it thinks the current state belongs in. It makes a prediction of what will happen next inside that region of space-time. So, which is where Hawkins came up with the term hierarchical temporal memory. You have the hierarchy. It's temporal in that each box refers to a region of space-time. It's also temporal in the sense that each box is making a prediction of what will happen in that box next. And HTM is a general sounding term, but it's often taken just to refer to Hawkins' network. So I introduced a longer and uglier term, which is a CSDLN, which is a compositional spatio-temporal deep learning network, which is uglier and harder to remember. I don't know how to pronounce it. On the other hand, it's not restricted only to one specific system like Hawkins. So this diagram evokes the kind of integration we're doing, where you have this spatio-temporal hierarchy, which is taking in image data. It does audition data too, but let's stick with images for concreteness. Takes in image data and represents it at different levels of coarseness, at different levels of the hierarchy. Then we have OpenCog's atom space shown up there, where you have nodes representing abstract concepts, for example, like eye, ear, mouth, eyeball, next to, above. And then you're building between them, basically. And the way you build between them is you take this spatio-temporal hierarchy and you recognize patterns in that hierarchy over time. And the interesting patterns recognized in this hierarchy, those interesting patterns are recorded as nodes and links in OpenCog's semantic network. So the the basic idea of the integration is take this lower level perceptual model, recognize recurring patterns in it, and then put those recurring patterns into the semantic network. So, you know, take the example of an eye, a human eye, right? The destined network will react a certain way to a human eye, and it will react a similar way to a human eye each time it sees it, once it has seen many eyes. By unsupervised learning, it will learn on its own to internally evoke a certain pattern of centroids across its nodes and links when it sees a human eye. So then, if we use a pattern mining algorithm to look for frequent patterns in this hierarchy, we can then map those patterns and represent them as nodes and links in OpenCog. And then you have links going in and out between destined over here and OpenCog over here. So this bubble and the other one are both OpenCog. OpenCog has nodes for eye and mouth and nose and so forth. Now, the subtlety here is that when we try to do that with destined right out of the box, it doesn't work very well, which is usual. Most things in AGI don't work very well. Sometimes you can get them to work by changing things around. Sometimes they just keep on not working. So in this case, we seem to be getting it to work by changing things around. And the main change we had to make is, in destined, in the classic form, each node, each little square on some level of the hierarchy representing a spatio-temporal region, each node came with its own library of centroids, representing what that node saw. And now that's okay. That's kind of like how the human visual cortex works, right? But it's kind of awkward. So imagine, look at this spatio-temporal hierarchy, right? Imagine it is seeing this cup. So now it's seeing this cup at one side of the eye, right? Now it's seeing this cup at the other side of the eye. So in the classic destined, when it sees the cup at this side of the eye, then the cup-related centroids here will become active. On the other hand, when you show the cup at this side of the eye, the cup-related centroids over here become active, right? And now, of course, eventually it may see a cup on every possible place, and it will learn those cup-related centroids everywhere. But from the point of view of trying to mine patterns from this network, that's confusing, because it may be centroid number 5 over here that represents the curve of the lid of the cup. Over here, it may be centroid number 27 that represents the curve of the lid of the cup. Each cell is basically separately learning to represent what it has seen, which is not necessarily bad. On the other hand, from the point of view of trying to use a pattern mining algorithm to mine patterns out of the network, it's annoying, right? So what we introduce is what I call uniform destined, where you have basically a common dictionary. You use the same library of patterns, first across every node on a given layer, but then you can also do a simple math transformation for a pattern on a lower layer can be ported into patterns on higher layers and so forth, and so forth, which is just like taking a picture and making it coarser grained or finer grained. You can go even further if you want, which we haven't done yet. So that what I just described basically makes the pattern recognition translation invariant and scale invariant. By being able to recognize a pattern at any side and at any hierarchical level, and then it's represented by the same centroid, by the same dictionary pattern. And that makes it much easier to recognize, for OpenCog to recognize that when the cup is seen over here, or over here, it's the same thing. And also at different distances, because if you're holding it near the camera or far from the camera, it's going to appear as bigger or smaller. Now, the way they get around that in computer vision is just to do some pre-processing to draw a little box around the thing they're seeing. But that's kind of a hack from an AGI point of view. If you just make your visual hierarchy scale invariant, like we've done with uniform destined, you don't have to do that. The same pattern can be recognized at any level of the hierarchy. And that makes it much easier to recognize patterns in the destined hierarchy. We have a Google Summer of Code student who's doing that this summer. Now, you can also take that a next level, which we haven't done in the code yet, which is to make it rotation and shear invariant, which is kind of interesting. Then then when a certain visual pattern is seen in a certain square, then you can say, okay, does that match anything I've seen before up to a certain rotation and shear? And you can store that information, which gets further and further from the visual cortex. But this gets at a more general point about integrative AGI systems, which I've seen again in working on OpenCog, which is whenever you want to put together one thing and another thing, where each thing carries out some part of general intelligence, you think you can just hook these two pieces together, but really, when you do it, you find you have to go in and modify this and this and this and this and this and this and this in each of the pieces. And in this case, it was destined. When we really dug into it, we saw the way it was representing things internally just made it quite cumbersome to recognize recurrent patterns in Destin's structure. Then by changing it to make it translation and scale invariant internally, that became much easier. And we found the same thing with everything else. For procedure learning, we wanted to use genetic programming. Then we found, well, but wouldn't it work better in terms of integration with the other components if we use probability theory instead of crossover and mutation? So we had a probabilistic semantics inside procedure learning. In declarative reasoning, way back in the dark ages, we were using Pei's NARS logic in the predecessor to OpenCog, and eventually that didn't work in the context of the rest of our integrative design. So we kept a lot of what was in NARS in terms of the term logic structure and using multi-component truth values, but we ended up replacing his unique NARS logic with a more conventional probabilistic logic still founded on term logic and multiple component truth values. So in one case after another, you find you can't actually take these separate systems and just glom them together. You can take separate systems, radically modify their internals, and then glom them together. And what you're doing when you radically modify their internals is kind of like what evolution did when it co-adapted each part of the human brain to work with each other. The parts actually have to be, to some extent, made to work together if you want to have an integrative system. And I think that is more time than I was going to take, so I'm done.